It's my pleasure to invite a very successful, famous young lady, someone who became famous at a very young age. Many years ago, she sat with a lot of statistical data on economics and then almost divined that India and a few other countries are going to go up there in a few years' time. And that did happen. Now, I think we saw in the last few years that the BRIC countries really came up, and India definitely did. Some of our politicians took it so seriously that they thought they could ride on it and actually spoil our chances. So the next few years is what she's going to tell us about. For those of you who don't know all the things she's achieved, she's the founder of Avasara Academy, dedicated to developing leadership potential of India's brightest young women. She's also written extensively on demographics, education, income, etc. She's a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee for JNNURM, and she's a member of the Aspen Institute of India's Leadership Initiative. She's done a lot of things at this young age. Now, we're going to have a few questions after you've spoken. One question, I'll give you a hint. You know, many years ago, Einstein created a lot of commotion in the university because he set an exam paper which is exactly the same as the exam paper of the previous year, not done. So, but he coolly said, look, yeah, same questions, but the answers are going to be different. So I'm giving you a hint about what question I'm going to ask if someone doesn't ask you. Okay? Please come on stage.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. Hi, everyone. I don't know how much credit one can take for doing a report that says when large population economies start to grow, they'll actually have a huge weight on the global economy. I think that we, put a group of countries together and really try to understand how to make the point that these countries are not just important from an emerging market perspective or as developing countries, but these are countries that are going to make the difference to the global economy. And right now we might see it in things like commodities, but in the future it's going to be looking at consumer markets, at domestic demand, as well as things like financial services. So I think that was the big point of doing the report that looked at the BRICS and tried to understand how they would grow over the long run. Since doing that report, and that's been nearly 10 years ago, I've really focused a lot of my research work on looking at understanding the demographics within India. I think this is a very over-discussed area. Everyone talks about India being very young, it's going to grow. This is a big impetus for focusing on India. However, no one's really done a lot of work to understand what it means. What are these patterns of both being very young as well as aging very quickly? How does that impact our savings behavior, our spending behavior? Also things that we always talk about like urbanization and migration. We don't really have a lot of good information about how these patterns are evolving. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that as economists, we can focus on GDP growth, interest rates, inflation, but what's going to really hold all of us together, and this is really important for entrepreneurs and for businesses, the things that really matter are the themes that once they start growing and moving in one direction, they really don't turn back the other way. These are the things that are going to grow in good times and in bad times. And I think for any businesses, this is really what's important to understand stability. So how can you really hold yourself strong? What markets can you look at, especially when you have volatility and have volatile times? Because again, once these demographic and structural trends start to move, you don't see them going backwards like you do with a lot of the headline growth statistics. So if someone can go to the next slide. So what I wanted to do is just highlight a little bit of how we think about these themes. And again, I do a lot of work focusing on the typical macro statistics, but really looking at understanding, in particular, things like urbanization, employment patterns is really going to be the key for India going forward. Can you guys see this chart? Okay, can you go back one slide? This slide basically shows within the BRICS report the growth trend for both China and India over the long run. So this is trend growth, obviously taken out a few decades. The point that I really wanted to make with this one is that if you look at India, which is the lighter blue line that stays higher, GDP trend growth for India stays higher for much longer relative to China. So China had a really good run in the last decade. But no one really has seen the sort of population pressure that China is going to see in this coming decade. So around 2017, 2018, all of a sudden, the amount of sort of retired people, dependents that a working age person will have in China dramatically increases. And we've not seen in any country this kind of change demographically happen in such a short period of time. So that really weighs heavily on trend growth for China. India has two things going for it. One, we do have, at least in the numbers, this really great sweet spot that lasts for 3 decades where we have a high number of employable people relative to dependents. The second big thing is that when you look at productivity growth and you look at the catch-up period that India has in terms of its income per capita relative to the developed economies, we just have so much more scope for catch-up. Our income per capita is at a much more nascent stage relative to any of the rest of the BRICS. So when you just look at, and we see that now, and even within India, when you look at the diversity that we were talking about earlier, when you see what happens with rural incomes and the structural changes that happen just as income starts to grow, that movement just takes place over a much longer period of time for India. So we get a boost from both of those things going forward. You can go to the next slide. There are basically 4 big trends that I think in terms of demographics that are going to define India. The first is urbanization. I'm going to just tell you them quickly, and then we'll go through a couple of slides on each of them. The first is urbanization, and urbanization is really poorly understood in terms of how it's evolving in India, but it'll become very important. The second is employment patterns, and particularly the employment of women. So we've seen since 2003, since India has really gone through its growth spurt, there hasn't been much that's changed in terms of employment by geography, employment by education, but what we have seen is that there's been a really significant rise in the participation rates of women in both rural and in urban areas. And once this starts to happen, again, this has huge implications for fertility rates, for spending patterns, and again, when we see this in other countries, this doesn't go back. So once you start seeing these things rise, they start to affect household patterns in a very significant manner. The third thing that's really important is just looking at our age structure. So as we're very young, it can be both a very positive thing and, as we all know, also a very negative thing. And it can implode if we don't figure out how to employ our young people. But there are very important implications as you go through a life cycle of a person in terms of how they spend and how that'll affect domestic demand for India. And I'm going to go through how we see that and where the biggest growth spurts are going to take place for overall GDP. The last, which I'm just going to mention right now, but I won't spend too much time on, is migration. India is one of these, and again, we just heard it in Sunil's talk. India has the kind of diversity within one country that you only see in the spans of continents. So fertility rates is one of the great examples. The kind of diversity we see, where in a Kerala or in South India, we've gone through the demographic transition and we're actually aging. Our fertility rates are lower than what you see in France. When you go to the north and the northeast, our fertility rates are nearing 3.5. That kind of diversity you only see in a continent like Africa. And so when you're dealing with one country that has such diversity in terms of, let's say, something like fertility rates, migration also gets heavily impacted. And what we think is going to happen is that you're going to see a lot of north to south and center to periphery migration. And that'll be very important for just thinking about economic geography. You can go to the next slide. As I said, urbanization is going to be huge in this coming decade in terms of how much it affects GDP growth. If you take all of the different demographic trends that will affect India, age structure, urbanization, education. It's going to be urbanization in this decade that gives us the biggest boost, close to a percentage point to GDP in the next now 7 years. We did a study that looked at the top 20 cities in India and tried to understand how these different cities are evolving in terms of their savings and their spending patterns. And when we took these 20 cities, we didn't just do a population cut. We looked at how deep these markets are in terms of how much households spend in a given year. And what we found is that you get a lot of the population cut cities. You get some cities that wouldn't be very traditional because households may earn the same amount as the biggest cities, but households just seem to spend a lot more of their incomes. So there seems to be very big markets in small pockets. And I think one of the big sort of strategic sort of takeaways from this is that there's a whole set of cities, just because of population, that will service demographic sectors, things like financial services, food, clothes. But there's a smaller set of cities that, because households have this characteristic of spending so much of their income, the rapidity with which consumer behavior is evolving just happens much more quickly in these smaller towns and cities. So sectors that are focused on things like housing, leisure, education, services would do well to think of deeper addressable markets in these smaller cities. When we look at these, the top 20 cities in India, they make up less than 10% of India's population, but they're important because they make up more than 30% of income. So it's still, in terms of absolute values, these cities are important. Can we see the next slide? When you look at growth, across all of these cities, growth has averaged just under 12%, and we think it's going to be closer to 10% in the next 5 years. But what's interesting is that it's the Tier 2 cities that have registered the fastest growth. And the Tier 2 cities are actually the bookends. So they have very fast growth, but there's a handful of them that also are the slowest in our group. The Tier 1 cities, so the ones that are 5 million people plus, the typical mega cities that we see in India, are kind of in between. And then our pocket of smaller cities are kind of more stable and more average growth in terms of averaging about 10% within the group. You see the next slide? When you look at across all of these cities, it's very important to take into account differences in cost of living. So one of the things that we found is that when you look at cities that have the highest income per capita, it's not a Mumbai or an Ahmedabad. It's actually a Surat that has the highest income per capita after you adjust for differences in cost of living, so looking at CPI. And, some of these smaller cities end up becoming very important. So this city, as an example, is the youngest in the entire group, has the highest rates of migration. As we all know, very big apparel market, bigger than any of the Tier 1 cities in terms of how big both the production as well as the consumption of apparel is. So there's a lot to understand within each of these cities that came across from this study. And it kind of highlights one of the things that I think about India in general, and it's something that we always say in our group, is that averages really don't mean anything here, right? We always talk about average income per capita, what an average household in urban India owns, but quite frankly, there's probably no one who lives in that average. We have such wide tails, and so for India, it's much more important to understand how wide we are across that average, and to understand how that changes as you move from sort of left to right. I'll give another example. When you look at something like food consumption, across all these cities, food consumption is about 30% of total consumption. When you go to a city like Coimbatore in the south, that number goes down to about 12% of total consumption, and households just spend much more on health. So across the board, when you looked at anything related to health, this city just had much more spending on something like that. So I think that's one of the underlying points to be made, that averages mean very little, and it's much more important to understand the diversity. You can go to the next slide. This is something that in our work we always look for. It's kind of the benchmark of when we see that more than half of all households in whatever group we're looking at will be middle class. And what we find is that by 2016, across the top 20 cities, more than half of households will cross that threshold. And low-income households have. So they go from about 16% to about 7%. Just by the middle of this decade. And this will become incredibly important because once you get to middle class, obviously you get past the basic sort of absorption of radios, televisions, white goods, and you start moving into more value-added services. So I think once we cross this threshold, you'll start to see a lot of, we'll start to be able to compare to what we've seen in other countries across the region. Can we go to the next one? And I think, this is one of the biggest points to be made about all of these cities, is that we might talk about average income, but households don't spend a lot of their income in a given year. So we need to know how much cities and households are actually spending. For India, this is incredibly important, right? Domestic demand and spending accounts for about close to 60% of GDP. In China, it's only 30%. And that's why for us, when we really think about what's interesting to India, we really care about how people are spending. If you go to a Bhopal and a Jalandhar, households spend more than 70% of their income, some close to 80%. If you look at it in Mumbai or in Ahmedabad, households only spend half, and some households spend even less than half. And one of the things that we think is that inflation has hit the tier 1 cities much harder in the last 5 to 10 years. When you look at real estate prices, gold prices, all of these things, it's become much more inflationary in the tier 1 cities. And only in the last couple of years has that started to filter down into tier 2 cities. What we think has happened is that households have reacted to sort of inflation expectations going unhinged by kind of hoarding in and saving until the environment becomes a little bit more stable. And you haven't seen that go down to tier 2 and tier 3 cities until very recently. You see the next slide? The second sort of theme, because I only have a couple of minutes to talk about this, that I mentioned is that women's employment participation has started to rise pretty dramatically. This is important because, you know, as we've seen as far back as you go in the data, women's employment participation in India, if you see this chart, it's all the way towards the right, is much lower than a host of any other countries you look at. If you look at Vietnam and China, women's participation is above 70%. In India, it's only just crossed 30%. So we've always been low, and actually it's always been falling. It's only since 2005 that we've started to see employment participation rates rise. Can you go forward? And this will be incredibly important because I think, you know, one of our biggest issues is that we have a host of very young people in the employable category, but our problem is that our participation rates are really low. They're pretty dismal. We have, you know, around 50 to 55%, if we're lucky, actually working. So if we can figure out in the next 3 decades how to get those participation rates up, that'll give us the most bang for our buck. And that can set us up really well for anything related to demographics, whether it is pensions, education, and so on. If we can actually act on this in the next 3 decades, we'll be in good shape. This is what's really going to define us. However, the only, at least for employment, the only real positive sort of story that we see is that women have started to going to work in much larger numbers. This becomes very important not because it's just about gender, but because it's about talent allocation. And I think once we get more people and more talent with these participation rates rising, all of a sudden you'll see GDP rise to the tune of about 1/3 more in terms of GDP in absolute levels than we have now. So this becomes really a huge deal. We talk about in the next decade that this trend alone can add about $110 billion to GDP. Can you go forward? I think I don't have much time, so I'll kind of flip through to one of the end slides. Can you keep going? Keep going. Keep going. I also want to make the point that we can just stop here. When you look at India's population and its working age structure, the last point I want to make is that it's really important to know that this stuff is huge in terms of trend growth. There are people who completely think that economics as well as stock markets are determined by demographics. When you look at India and China, you can very clearly see that age structure in China took off, and it was the 90s that you really saw a big dividend to China, whereas then it starts to tank. It was in one of those earlier slides. For India, it's really now to 2030 that from 1950 to 2000, we saw no change. And from now to 2030, all of a sudden, this big transition will happen. What happens when we start going to work? Can you forward to the next slide? Keep going. Is that, go back one, is this slide, which is when you look at who's going to be important to the labor force globally, this is not just an India story. What happens to India's labor force matters for the world because we'll add close to 80 million people to the global labor force. If you look at China, Brazil, US, Japan's actually taking away. India is really the only story in town. If we can figure out how to get people to work and work productively, and that's still a big if, this is going to be the story of the next decade. For us, as we're still very young, once we get into the sweet spot of moving into most of our working force being in their 30s, and even more importantly in their 40s, you can forward a couple of slides. I think the most important thing that we want to say is that these are the sectors that really benefit. So when we look at age structure, food, beverages, personal care, transport, and health are the important things to look at. Within consumption, I would say for us, all of these things really point to the subsector of consumption services rather than consumption goods that really benefit from these kinds of trends going forward. So I'll leave it there in terms of time. Do we have time for questions, or we may? No? One? So I think the end of the question was what differentiates the BRICS? Okay, we'll go back to the BRICS. I think one of, when we did the work on the BRICS, it was really, as I said in the beginning, it was an exercise to show that these big population economies are going to be the ones that define global markets. So they should not be put in an emerging market bucket anymore. The exercise that we did literally took the top four, at that time, emerging markets, and they're not really thought of as emerging markets anymore. So we just looked at the largest GDP, and it ended up being China, Brazil, Russia, India, and now that order has changed. I think you could do the same exercise for a host of other economies that look like their big population, as well as look like, in terms of their reform patterns, are moving in one direction. And we did that. There was a whole set of 17 other countries behind that. And now those are more the darlings than the BRICS, if you look at your Indonesias, your Mexicos, and so on. Vietnams. So I think that kind of set is really what people are looking at as the next frontier. I think for the BRICS, the issue is that by and large, their reform processes have been moving in a certain direction, although the timing has taken longer than we thought. So they've already become big influences in markets like commodities. What's interesting in this group in particular is that 2 are commodity producers and 2 are commodity takers. So there's an interesting balance between both of them. So when some do well, others don't do as well, and you always get this mix. So there's always a conversation about whether this is the right group. But quite frankly, I think that's the point, is that you're going to see this evolve over the next few decades. The good thing is we wouldn't have changed the set of countries that we chose, and I think the trend growth rates really stand on their own. The problem is that obviously the movements are very volatile. And for India, out of all of the BRICS, it's quite a bigger volatility around that trend growth than in the others. Thank you.